We've got the best wildlife cameras money can buy. We have the Sony Alpha 1 with its 600mm f4 and the teleconverter. Thought that'd be a time when you would jump in.
We have the Canon R5 II with a 600mm f4.
And his teleconverter. And then this, the Nikon Z9 with its 600 f4 with the built-in teleconverter. They all run you about $20,000. We're gonna test each one and we're gonna tell you how to get great results without spending as much money as a car by thanking our sponsor, KEH. KEH is the world's largest store for used camera gear. I buy all my used stuff from them. Check out our link here and use the coupon code from the description. That's the most current one. And that can save you an additional 5% on a lot of their gear.
They also have a warranty and a generous return period, so you really can't go wrong with KEH. Thanks, KEH. All three of these setups are about 10 pounds, but the Sony Alpha 1 is the lightest by a few ounces. All in all, I can't really tell the difference when I hold them. You could always mitigate the weight of the setup by using a tripod, or if you want to go handheld and you really can't handle 10 pounds, you could exercise. I'm not being cheeky. I have exercise to get my arms stronger for these things. Or if that's still not working, you could always go for a setup with a smaller, lighter lens.
For me, a big part of wildlife photography is just watching the wildlife through the viewfinder. And they all have pretty good viewfinders, but the Sony's here is definitely the best with 9 million dots. The Canon's is second best with about 5 million dots, and the Nikon's is definitely the worst. I'm not thinking about it all the time, but the Sony's is definitely sharper, especially when you're playing back images. The Canon here has a novel trick though. It has eye tracking autofocus in the viewfinder where it'll move the focusing point to the thing you're looking at. With wildlife photography, maybe there's 3 birds in the frame. You should be able to look at the bird that you're tracking and have it focus on that one and ignore the other ones. But I found in real life, it kept spotting fake subjects in the background, a little shadow that I thought was the eye of some other animal. And when I had eye tracking on, it would keep jumping off to the background and losing autofocus. That was after calibrating it a couple of times in different situations. So ultimately, I just ended up turning it off. So as far as the viewfinder goes, I have to give Sony the win with Canon in second.
I was just pretending to take a picture. Let's talk about the autofocus on these 3 cameras. Initially, the Sony Alpha 1 was in the lead with the best autofocus and the best detection of subjects, but Nikon and Canon have caught up. I owned the previous generation R5, and one of the reasons that I switched to the Alpha 1 was because the autofocus was so great on the Alpha 1. But now that I have this R5 II and I've tried it a while, it works just as well. Also, the Nikon's autofocus has caught up, and the Z9 and the Z8 both have excellent autofocus and excellent subject detection. They all still are flaky sometimes, but I'm very thankful for the new subject detection. It does miss, it does sometimes think there's an eye in a tree or something like that, but overall it will help you track your subject and get more photos in focus.
Frames per second is so important on a wildlife camera, especially with fast-moving subjects like birds. Even just as they're flapping their wings, 30 frames per second gives you more options. It gives you the option of picking the bird's perfect wing position, the one where the shadow of the wing isn't blocking the eye. So I always shoot at the highest frames per second possible. The Canon and the Sony will do 30 frames per second RAW, which is amazing considering they're both high megapixel cameras. The Z8 and the Z9, they do 30 frames per second JPEG, but we find RAW files to be really important.
Watch me edit this high contrast underexposed eagle photo in both JPEG and RAW simultaneously. The RAW file did a better job of restoring the blues because it has more color information. The RAW file also has far more shadow information.
So we only shoot RAW, and in those situations, the Z8 and the Z9 are limited to 20 frames per second. So that's kind of a big loss for Nikon, but there are some other advantages that bring Nikon back into the lead, and I'll talk about that in a bit. The Nikon Z9 has 2 CF Express Type B cards, the best memory configuration you can have. And you can essentially shoot forever without it buffering because those memory cards are really fast. The Sony A1 has 2 CF Express Type A cards, and those are much worse. They're more expensive, they're only available in smaller capacities, and they write at about half the speed. As a result, the A1 will buffer after like 6 or 7 seconds, but it keeps shooting at a pretty good pace. The Canon has 1 CF Express Type B card and 1 SD card. And that means if you want to shoot backups, which you should, you're writing RAW to the fast card and JPEGs to the slower card so that it doesn't bottleneck on the slower card. And in those situations, I found that it kept shooting continuously for about 6 seconds, and then it would slow down to about 7 to 8 frames per second. That's much better than the R5. The R5 buffered quickly, and then it would shoot in bursts, missing entire seconds sometimes. So the R5 Mark II really improved here.
So often when you're taking wildlife photos, you're panning to track your subject. And if you're using the highest frame rate possible and your electronic shutter so it's silent, you might get some rolling shutter. In fact, on the original Canon R5, that was one of the deal breakers for me. My rolling shutter was so bad that all of the straight things in the background would be tilted. And when I took a picture of a hummingbird flapping its wings really fast, they were distorted because it was not reading the information to the sensor fast enough to capture my subject still. Canon, with the R5 Mark II, has almost completely gotten rid of their rolling shutter. I think it's pretty indistinguishable. I haven't had a chance to photograph a hummingbird, but I have done a lot of panning with straight reeds and docks in the background, and there is the most minor tilt, but I don't think it's distracting in the photo. When it comes to the Sony Alpha 1 and the Nikon Z9, there's no rolling shutter. The readout speed is fast enough that that's not a problem, but I think you'll be happy with all three options this time. Now, we are covering the most expensive gear, but that doesn't mean you can't get a good deal on it, because if you go to KEH, they have the Sony Alpha 1, they're gonna have an older Z8 or Z9, they probably will be getting the R5 Mark II in soon, and then they have a huge assortment of used lenses in great condition, so you could probably get a 600mm prime or some zoom lenses for wildlife. They're gonna have a large assortment. If you're not in the market for the most expensive setup that there is to offer, you're gonna find great deals on things like the Nikon D850, a DSLR that you can get for a great price at this point, or an older version of a Sony or a Canon camera, the original R5. Also, they give us a coupon to pass along to you and you can get 5% off. We're gonna put that coupon code in the description down below because it's constantly changing and we wanna make sure that we get credit for just being like glowing in our videos. So thank you KEH for making this video possible, and thanks to all of you for supporting our reviews. Let's get into more information.
I was really inspired by Mark Smith to get into wildlife video, which is so much harder than wildlife stills photography. Oh my God, like first you definitely need a super big heavy tripod. By the way, bought this from KEH. But then you also need just a lot of patience. It's very hard to get the subjects in the frame and in focus and move it smoothly as things move around. So it's really challenging on the camera. Now, the Sony A1 does not do any kind of animal eye detect in video, which is really disappointing because I totally think it's capable and Sony should give us a firmware update, but they haven't. So in that way, for videographers, like the Sony is actually way behind. The Nikon and the Canon both do animal eye detect in video, and they both do 8K at 60 frames per second raw. Neither one does great animal eye detect in video. It doesn't work nearly as well as when you're shooting stills, but they both work okay and they're better than nothing. I also say that 8K 60 RAW produces huge, huge files. So you want to get at least 1 terabyte CF Express type B cards, which can be pretty expensive. As I've been editing the video, the Nikon video is kind of a pain to edit. The only video editor that supports the Nikon RAW is DaVinci Resolve Studio, the one you have to pay for. So I have to import it into that and then export it so I can edit it in Final Cut, which is my preferred platform. The Canon RAW files, they have a plugin that does work with Final Cut. So I wish you could give us that, Nikon. Also, the Nikon and Canon have 2 card slots, which is great for backups, but they only record RAW to 1 card at a time, which means you don't get a backup of this super important footage that you're capturing. So overall, I feel like right now the winner for video is actually the Canon. I find the autofocus works just a little bit better and the 8K 60 RAW is a little bit easier. So great work at pulling ahead on wildlife video, Canon.
Both the Canon and the Nikon have features that allow you to get photos before you ever press the shutter. It's like magic. Nikon's is called the pre-release burst, but you can only capture the images in JPEG. I give them credit for that because, you know, JPEG works sometimes with wildlife and it's better than nothing. Canon has a feature called pre-continuous shooting. I'm peeking at my notes for these names because they're not that fun and I can't remember them. But pre-continuous shooting can actually be done in RAW with Canon, so I give them the advantage there because I like to shoot in RAW with wildlife and I'm getting my photos before I press the shutter. It's just amazing. I wish that Sony would come up with that soon. So let's do that, Sony. If you're wondering why you need that feature, it's because the human reaction time is pretty slow and wildlife can be really unpredictable. So I'll give you a few scenarios. One, you're taking pictures of a bird on a branch and you're waiting for it to take off and get into flight. You might miss it if your reaction time isn't fast enough, but with pre-capture, it will record before you press the shutter and you can get that pivotal moment that you're looking for. Another example is if you're waiting for something like an egret to pull a fish from the water. If you've watched that before, you know they can dunk their heads many times before they catch a fish. And if you don't want to have to deal with sorting through a bunch of photos where you didn't get the shot, you can rely on pre-capture to wait until you see it got a fish, start shooting, and know that it's going to record the moment.
Wildlife photographers need as much detail as possible because the animals don't want to get close to you, so you often can't fill the frame, right? That's why we're only testing these high megapixel cameras. The Canon and Nikon have 45 megapixels, the Sony has 50 megapixels. We don't see any difference in real world usage. There's no sharpness differences that we can test between the three $13,000 plus 600 f4 lenses. Here's a picture of a test chart. First, comparing the Nikon to Sony, zoomed in 300%, I really can't see any difference. Comparing the Canon to the Sony, no teleconverter, again, I just don't see any difference. But there is one significant difference. This Nikon 600 f4 has a built-in teleconverter. I can flip between 1 times and 1.4 times zoom. This has made the biggest difference of any advancement that I've seen in wildlife photography in the past 10 years for me. Here's the thing, especially with flying birds, you never know when that bird is going to come at you and be close. And if you have a teleconverter on, there's no way to take the teleconverter off in time in order to fill the frame with just 600 millimeters. But when the bird is farther away, you want your teleconverter on so that you capture as much detail as possible. So as a wildlife photographer, I always have my teleconverter in my pocket and I'm trying to decide if I should put it on if the birds are far away and they're going to stay far away, but if there's any possibility that they get closer, I leave it off because I don't want to overfill the frame. With this built-in teleconverter, I'm always ready to zoom in or zoom back. And that means when birds are farther away, I'm getting significantly more detailed images. Let's imagine there's a Nikon and a Sony shooter side by side. The birds are flying pretty close, so the Sony shooter decides to leave off the teleconverter. But the best shot of the day happens a little bit further away when you would need to crop. Zoomed way in, we see just distinctly more detail from the Nikon. Before you pick your winner, Chelsea, I just want to say one more good thing about the Nikon Z9 is it has built-in GPS, and that allows me to go and look on a map in Lightroom Classic and see where I took all my photos. If I share my pictures with another wildlife photographer, I can choose to include that GPS information. That means they can sort of retrace my steps and see where I found a particular animal. Which one is your favorite? Which are you going to shoot with?
Oh my gosh, well, I'm just going to throw everything off because the Sony Alpha 1 is what I shoot with, and I really like the 200 to 600 lens.
Yeah.
And so because of the lens that I like, the zoom lens, I'm going to stay with the Sony Alpha 1, but I am jealous of a few features on the other cameras. Pre-capture is one of them. I wish that the Sony had pre-capture, and the teleconverter on the Nikon lens would be super helpful if I had that. So I think they're all winners. You just kind of have to choose which features you want the most.
Yeah, you really want like a Frankenstein with the pre-buffer of the Canon, the lens of the Nikon here.
Mm-hmm.
I think right now I'm going to stick shooting with the Nikon Z9. But really, the Canon R5 II is such a good camera. Like, it doesn't deserve to lose. I just wish they would build if they were to build the teleconverter into the lens, I would switch to the Canon because the 30 frames per second RAW is better. The video is better than the Sony. But still, the lens often is the most important part of the camera, and Nikon right now makes the best lens. So I'm sticking with the Nikon. Like in the comments, let me know what you think. Right now, there's not really a real loser.
And you can't go wrong with any of these or by shopping at our sponsor, KEH. So if you want to buy your new camera, a lens, accessories, check out KEH and don't forget to use our coupon code down below. That will save you 5% on some of the gear. So thanks so much, KEH. And thanks to all of you for watching. If you want to see more reviews like this or any updates to these reviews, be sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. I think that's pretty crucial. Bye.
Bye.
Let's skedaddle.